Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update for the 21st of May 2023. I've got a good cup of tea. I've got your good selves. Let's hand in hand romp through the ravaged meadows of the Ukraine war news. We'll start with the Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, and there are some significant numbers on here. These are, as I always say, indicatively useful. Watch out for over-exaggeration, propaganda, inaccuracy, but I do find these give a good indication of trends and also a lot more accurate than critics give them credit for being. 730 liquidated personnel is an uptick from the previous days. In fact, that's one of the highest I've seen probably for a month. I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. 2 tanks. Okay, fairly low. I've talked about how I don't think the Russians have many tanks left to throw at presently their defense, I guess, but previously at their offensive. 16 APCs is high. That's a high number of APCs. 29 artillery systems. The last few weeks has been phenomenal. I'm sure someone could go out there and check the last few weeks, but it has been a terrible time for Russian artillery. There's been explicit targeting and counter-battery efforts. There have been drone attacks. There's been all sorts going on. That is a really terrible day in both of those categories. And 2 anti-aircraft warfare systems is not good for the Russians. It does depend what those are, of course. Are they just autocannons, or are they something like an S-300 or somewhere in the middle, maybe a book system? 21 drones. There's a drone attack last night of 4 drones, so that will be entailing the night before as well, or maybe just the night before. There's often a delay with numbers that come through from the night before. 12 vehicles and fuel tanks and 2 pieces of special equipment, things like electronic warfare, or it could be a deminer, excavator, all sorts of stuff. So that is, I think, another bad day for the Russians. There's a consistent degradation of their capacity, which then affects their capability to operate on the battlefield. Right, as I said, 4 Shahed drones last night. That's kind of a low count for what we've seen over the previous week. Whether that indicates that the Russians have started to run out of their Shaheds again, I don't know, or they're just taking a night off waiting to get some more cruise missiles to use them in unison with them. Who knows? This is something that I've kind of hinted at last couple of days when trying to discuss Bakhmut and where to now. So the idea is that the fighting in Bakhmut might well have been more attritional for the Russians than fighting around Bakhmut. That by ceding the entirety of Bakhmut to the Russians now, we might not see as much attrition. Well, actually, against that, Alexander Karchenko says that Wagner sustained many times more casualties when fighting in fields, i.e. on the flanks, than inside of Bakhmut. He said this was primarily due to the lack of armoured vehicles. Rob Lee says, I think the Wagner model of using a large number of convicts mixed with professional fighters works best in dense urban terrain. It isn't as effective in open fields where commercial drones and artillery and machine guns are extremely lethal to unsupported infantry assaults. And we've seen that they have traditionally been using, they've been using these human waves without the support of mechanized equipment. There's not been combined arms maneuvers. It's particularly around Bakhmut. We have seen that to some extent elsewhere, but still a distinct lack of that within the Russian operations. So this would lead one to think possibly that actually Russian losses could be higher, given that the Ukrainians have now ceded Bakhmut. As they fight out in those fields, in the surrounding flanks, but also moving on towards zielinski, if they try to do that from Bakhmut and then on towards Chasiv Yar, the Russians will lose an even greater number of forces. So, yeah, interesting claim there. This is the only drone eye view I think I've seen of a Javelin engagement from launch to impact, seen from lower right to the middle of the clip. I'm just including this because it is quite significant. We have a couple of vehicles getting taken out by different munitions in this video. I'm just going to, so you see one there, but we're going to be concentrating on this vehicle here, and to the bottom right there is a and you can see that vehicle's been hit and the troops are getting out. Often you assume that the people inside these vehicles get taken out when they're hit with these substantial munitions, but actually quite often they survive. The armor does its job, but although the vehicle is inoperational. But you're going to see a really very close a javelin shot from somewhere around here very soon, unless I don't know what I'm talking about, and that second vehicle getting taken out. And then we see it actually from the view potentially of the javelin. I'm not 100% sure whether it's the same. There you see, there goes up and a top attack. That's an amazing bit of footage there. Really gives you a sense of what these javelins do in their top attack uh, methodology, and then also how close you can be to that uh, to the target. So that's that bit of footage, and then here apparently it's not 100% that this is the same incident, but it could well be. I mean, it's got that kind of orangey fog, probably early morning fog. Here we have the person with the javelin and the guy pointing out it's just over there. A lot of small arms fire going on as well. Pretty excited seeing it over there. And then fires it off. As you can see, that's really close, and they're pretty happy with that. So I show you that not because it's particularly relevant to the news, I guess, but it's just some interesting footage that then you start look. I suppose it is relevant. You start looking at these numbers, and you see, well, in that bit of footage, there was at least two bits of equipment taken out. It looks like two APCs taken out there. I don't know if the first one was a tank. I think it was an APC. Right, going back to a couple of days ago when I talked about how Mariupol was hit with what was probably Storm Shadow missiles. A few more details are coming out about this. It was at the airport, but it looks like it was barracks at the airport rather than the helicopters that were reportedly there. Ukraine reportedly used the Storm Shadow missile to strike a large building by the Mariupol airport, killing more than 100 soldiers. There are varying claims here. There's some saying that actually there was, I forget the numbers, somewhere around 30 soldiers killed and a bunch more injured. And there's some people saying 100 to 150. So you get varying numbers being thrown around. Destroying a lot of Russian military gear. Russia sends soldiers to Mariupol, using it as a staging area to supply troops to Bakhmut. This has all been sort of geolocated, and there are satellite images that show the destruction. This is a case of Storm Shadow cruise missiles being used really effectively, bunker busting, taking out buildings. And I think there's been talk about underground bunkers being taken out as well by Storm Shadow, but I'll have to look into that. So there's a lot of information here online about, well, I say a lot of information is fairly much the same information repeated. Looking at the damage that the Storm Shadows have done in Mariupol. Yeah, that is, I would guess, going on a nightly basis, arguably, as in, this has just been added to with some other stuff. I don't know. I'd need to look into that. On the flip side of these Ukrainian claims, they're the Russian claims. So yesterday they came out with apparently intercepting 12 Storm Shadow cruise missiles and HIMARS rockets, as well as a US guided bomb. Now, the Ukrainians are kind of pulling their hair out their inability to intercept guided bombs, that the FAB 500s and similar that the Russians are using. So it's incredibly surprising that the Russians are successful at intercepting guided bombs. But there you go. The Russians just make these fanciful claims, and that's why I don't report what the Russians claim, because they're just on a daily basis making insane claims that are just so unrealistic that I really dismiss them out of hand. Now, there are pro-Russian voices on my threads that say, "Why don't you report these?" I tell you time and again, that's why I don't report. When the MOD is saying they've taken out 430 odd Ukrainian fixed-wing aircraft, and they only had 124 to start the war with, you know that they're just lying through their teeth. So there you go. Um, what? Oh yeah. So I was including this bit of, again, it's not particularly news, but I think it gives you an idea of the adaptation of the here. I presume these are Russian trenches. The adaptation, yes, this is Ukrainian, I think, drone, but we are starting to see trenches now being protected by the Russians here. We've seen metal wires, sort of chicken wire over the top. This isn't so much chicken wire; it's kind of tarp, but it is still has a protective element to it that possibly, you know, means that drone munitions bounce off them. But here we can see one kind of falling through the holes and causing trouble inside there. So they are adapting. How effective that adaptation is open to debate. Right, Berdyansk was hit last night. So Berdyansk is on the coast of the Azov Sea between Mariupol and basically Melitopol, but Melitopol's not on the sea. I guess between Mariupol and Crimea. That was hit. We are seeing softening of loads of targets around the Zaporizhia region. Ukraine really are doing a really significant job of hitting a variety of things behind Russian lines. Multiple explosions have also been heard, and a fire appears to be burning in a Shebekinsky district of the Belgorod region in western Russia. So this is inside Russia. That seems to be fires going on there. Okay, moving on to odds and sods. We'll look at first. I did mention this yesterday. Authorities rushed to a club in Krasnodar after a song containing the words "Ukraine is not dead" was sung with gusto. So some people in the bar singing that song. Interesting. Former Eurovision entrant Verka Serduchka's song has now been removed from the playlist in the club, and the club has made a groveling apology. And yesterday I talked about this and said, look, for all you pro-Russians out there advocating for Russia and against Ukraine, is this what you want? I mean, is this the freedom that you want? Not being able to play certain songs, not being able to say the word war, being put in prison for longer for criticizing something politically in your own country than for stabbing two people 9 times. So that someone was given a lenient sentence because the people they were stabbing were critical against the war, but you can be put in prison for being critical against war for 7 to 10 years, and someone was in prison for stabbing two people 9 times, 2 years and 4 months. Is that the country you want to live in? Is that your idea of the best place to live? Is that much better than Ukraine? Just I don't understand. I'm just so staunchly pro-Ukrainian now, in a very obvious way, uh, uh, because I think the moral argument has been won convincingly, and there is no way Russia can win a moral argument here when they've committed war crimes to the level that they have, and when you just but it's often looking at the little things as well, banning a song in a club, just ridiculous. Anyway, sorry. A video has appeared where Zelensky has answered questions about Bakhmut. There's been a bit of controversy over this. He said, uh, in answer to several questions, he said, the enemy destroyed everything. Today, there is only land and many dead Russians. Our defenders did a great job there. We are very grateful to them for that. He also answered a question directly on Bakhmut, where he said, no, I don't think they are still in, as in the Ukrainians are not still in Bakhmut. And then his press office came out and said, no, he thought he was answering something else. Or, like, it's as if they're not happy to admit that Bakhmut's been lost. My opinion is, meh, it's just a bunch of buildings. And like I talked to you about last few days, it's about the utility of Bakhmut and about what the overall strategy of the entire, operation or all of these operational areas are. What does Bakhmut play in that? And are they still able to achieve their goals in and around that area, even though they don't own a particular bunch of buildings? So I'm kind of like meh about Bakhmut, whereas other people are trying to play it really carefully because of all the PR implications. And there's an example. But at the same time, this is Bakhmut in 2018. Lovely spring day in May when men and children came out to celebrate Vyshyvanka Day. Nestled amidst picturesque landscapes, the city was rich in history, culture, and elegant architecture. And then came Ruski Mir, the Russian world. Just it's just rubble now, and all this happiness and color. That is again part of this kind of moral evaluation of what the Russians are doing. That's liberation, is it? Well, not sure I'd want that pretty much anyway. Okay, significant movement of Russian heavy armor and equipment has been noted over the last 48 hours along the highway from the city of Donetsk towards the front line in the north near Bakhmut. Again, talking about this utility of Bakhmut, what is it to the Ukrainians? It is a way of fixing Russian forces, attracting their reserves to there, so they're throwing all their reserves into Bakhmut, which leaves their other places weak, or if not weak in a prima facie sort of first line of defense, then there are no reserves to help in those areas, so that's where you might strike for your counteroffensive. You're just drawing the Russian troops into the Bakhmut area. Yeah, success for the Ukrainians. Now, this is a bit of a odds and sods here piece that is really relevant for my next week or so. Syriac maps, now that Bakhmut has fallen, they say that they are saying that actually that it seems they're having a week or so off. So Syriac maps are not going to update their mapping until the end of May, and that will affect my mapping. I lean quite heavily on Syriac maps as giving me an indication of pro-Russian mappers, but also they're pretty accurate, certainly when the Russians are on the offensive. So that is going to be something I'm going to have to deal with. I hope that won't affect my mapping too much. I'm going to just have some tea. Longer I bang on, the colder it gets, right? Okay, we're moving on to military aid. So, and other sorts of aid and associated subjects. So, the US has announced additional security assistance to Ukraine. It's $375 million package. I talked yesterday about whether it's wise to put a dollar number on that because people get a little bit annoyed. Why are they spending that money here and not there? Just announce a package, but there you go. Additional ammunition. So what does it include? Additional ammunition for HIMARS, 155 and 105 artillery rounds, tube launched. So those are NATO rounds. Tube launched, optically tracked, wire guided missiles. Those are tow missiles for the top of the Bradleys. So obviously stocking up for Bradleys to be used effectively across the counteroffensive. Javelin and 84 anti-armor systems. Laser guided rocket system munitions, demolition munitions. Now, this is, I think, stuff that gives you an indication of the future counteroffensive, which is armored bridging systems, armored medical treatment vehicles, trucks and trailers to transport heavy equipment, logistics support equipment, and then thermal imagery systems, spare parts for other field equipment. I think that those are super important pieces of kit that aren't your headline grabbing Leopard Abrams tanks, so on and so forth. But you can't use those tanks if you don't have these other logistics or armored engineering vehicles to do their stuff. Right. Previously, we've seen on such lists of equipment being given to Ukraine, Riverine Boats from the States, particularly. And here, this is the first time I've seen them being sort of videoed in such an overt way. They're using these. So Ukrainian warriors putting American river boats to good use. Says this source. Let's have a little look at these boats. Not quite sure what you're saying there, but I'm here. You can see that they can be used. There are probably different types of boats here. Some can be used. I don't know if they're different types or whether it's the same ones, gunboats, as well as being able to carry some troops as well. This will be a training video to do some maneuvers along the river, Dnipro River. One assumes. Actually, you can see that was more of an amphibious, more of a landing craft there. That's a landing craft compared to some of the other riverine boats. Anyway, that's just an indication of the variety of equipment that Ukraine has been given over time. The Italian PM said that Italy may train Ukrainian pilots, but can't supply the F-16s. Italy may commit to training Ukrainian fighter pilots. Italian Prime Minister Meloni said at a news conference following the G7 summit. Italy does not operate F-16s. That's why they're not going to provide them of its own, and therefore cannot provide F-16 jets to Ukraine. But they're still supporting the provision of F-16 capability to Ukraine. These these training simulators, it's kind of plug and play as far as I understand them. You can train people on F-16s and then put a different system and train them on a different plane. So you can be in any country you like as long as you've got those simulators. You can train Ukrainian pilots accordingly. So that's how lots of countries are able to assist, even if they don't necessarily have F-16 planes themselves. Right. I'm sure someone else can set me straight on any wayward claims I make. This is breaking, but I haven't seen this verified anywhere else. I need to look into it, so take it with a pinch of salt. I was informed that 45 ex-Danish and Dutch F-16 AM/BM Fighting Falcon fighter jets will be delivered to the Ukrainian Air Force as an attrition replacement for its lost MiG-29s during the war with Russia. SABCA in Belgium will overhaul and upgrade the aircraft before delivery. So Belgium getting really involved in this coalition. Some people have been a little bit critical on the sort of Belgian assistance, given they've got quite an active arms export industry, but haven't given an awful lot of equipment. But they're going to play a really major role in this coalition, and that's super important. I also don't know enough about the F-16 variants to know whether they are the most modern. I presume they're not, and that's why they're going to get overhauled and upgraded. I need to go and check out some information on that. Rheinmetall, so that's the German military industrial concern, wants a joint venture with Ukraine to produce armored vehicles. I've talked about how this is one of the most important entities in terms of military aid and provision of equipment to Ukraine. German automotive and defense manufacturer Rheinmetall wants to work jointly with the Ukrainian state defense contractor Ukroboronprom to manufacture Fuchs armored personnel carriers. Rheinmetall CEO Armin Perpiger told German publication Bild. And of course, this is going to be hugely to the benefit of Rheinmetall. They are, all their Christmases have come at once, but that is to the benefit of Ukraine as well. There's a mutual benefit there. You can talk about the whether you are in support of the military-industrial complex making gazillions of money out of war, but that is war. If a country is going to invade another country illegally and immorally, then people need to come to the assistance of the invaded country. And if you don't have, entirely state producers of equipment, then the private sector is going to have to fill in the gaps there. And without the private sector doing that, certain countries would be in trouble anyway, but Ukraine would be in trouble if you didn't have, Lockheed Martin, you didn't have Rheinmetall, you didn't have all these companies saying, "Yep, we can do that, we can provide this," and making profit out of that. Then you would struggle to be able to support Ukraine in that way. So I guess that's the nature of the beast. SZ, and that's Süddeutsche Zeitung, I think. It's a newspaper, doesn't believe that the EU can get Ukraine in a year the 1 million artillery shells it promised. Arsenals are empty, and a French veto to buy outside Europe makes this difficult. I thought that had been resolved. I thought France had stepped back on that, but I could be wrong. But anyway, that's a newspaper article that seems to present this as being a claim that the EU is unable to fulfill, or a pledge they're unable to fulfill. Talking about military aids, these are British supplied Bulldogs, FV432 armour personnel carriers in the western part of Ukraine, obviously on some kind of training or because I guess when you see them driving, it's not like they're moving from A to B. These are tracked vehicles, and tracks don't last forever. And they're obviously not very efficient as well in terms of use of fuel and whatnot. So whenever you want to get tanks or tracked vehicles or any kind of vehicle from A to B in kind of large distances, you're going to put them on trucks and trailers and send them uh, by road or by train. So anytime you see them being used like this, they are in training or in an offence. Right. Okay. Moving on to geopolitics. Some really interesting diplomacy going on here. The French government plane that transported Zelensky from Saudi Arabia to Japan for the G7 summit was granted overflight rights by both India and China. Now, that is interesting, and you can wonder about the positioning of India and China with regard to Zelensky and to Ukraine. And actually, we'll come on to that in a second. So Zelensky has been super busy. I've talked the last couple of days about how this man is the hardest working politician I think I've ever known. Zelensky offered a formula for peace to the world. We developed the peace formula so that each of its points was supported by UN resolution so that everyone in the world can choose the item that is able to help implement. And he's talking with the G7 there, and from Japan to the Arab countries, from Europe to Latin America. We find support for the peace formula and we continue this work. He's very clever with his words. I've talked to you about this before, or the Ukrainians are in general. They use very unifying language all the time. And they talk about how there is universal support for peace, how, we, even in his speeches domestically, he's talking about the whole range of people within Ukraine. He's trying to unite Ukraine and talk about how everyone is doing their bit towards this single goal of Ukraine being victorious and there being lasting peace afterwards and prosperity for Ukraine. Well, here, from Japan to the Arab countries, Europe to Latin America, our formula develops is drawing on individual points from UN resolutions that everyone in the world can choose to help with. He's just very clever with the way that he is uniting the world in a way that Putin isn't. Putin is very much isolationist, and it's us against the world. And just the two very different ways of doing politics, and one I would say is much more successful than the other. So Zelensky is met bilaterally as well as in terms of the whole of G7 with all of the G7 leaders. So he's had a meeting with Biden, he's had a meeting with all sorts of different leaders. Now, it's hugely significant that Zelensky has met with Modi, Narendra Modi, the PM of India. This India is one of those countries that, hey, Ukraine really needs to get on side. They have an interesting geopolitical relationship with China because they're part of BRICS, like Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, as a set of nations who are trying to present themselves as an alternative to the US hegemony and potentially to replace the US dollar as the international currency, or at least for trade within themselves, so on and so forth. But India don't actually get on all that well with China, and there are tensions there. And so Ukraine could perhaps capitalize on that situation. And this is, I'd love to have been a fly on the wall there. I don't know how long these meetings were and how much they would have achieved, but they are significant. And he's met with South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol. They talked about the situation at the front, and of course, our state's repulse of full-scale aggression. Is the quote there. We discussed the recent visit of the Ukrainian delegation to the Republic of Korea. I'm grateful for the attention to the projects presented by the First Lady of Ukraine. Now, South Korea is super important. Why? Because they are increasingly an important arms exporter globally. As you see Russia slip down that top 10, South Korea are moving up. They are consistently at war. They're at war with North Korea. And as a result, they have a significant arms industry that is exporting increasingly to the rest of the world. Take, for example, Poland, that's bought a shed load of stuff from South Korea. And they also have a useful a useful way of doing their arms business, which is you buy initially a bunch off Korea that gets made in South Korea, and then you have the license to make it indigenously back in your own country. So Poland is then making some of the Korean equipment back in Poland, which then supports their own sort of economy and their own jobs and whatnot. So, yeah, South Korea is an important arms exporter. So Zelensky will know that. He will want. At the moment, they aren't providing stuff directly for Ukraine, so they could really help with ammunition. They will have a huge uh, repository of ammunition, I'm sure, shells for artillery. But what they are doing, I gather, and I reported on this previously, is exporting ammunition to, say, the US, and then US gives a bunch of their stuff to Ukraine. So it's kind of two sides of a square, really. But a significant meeting there, I'm sure. And then with the Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau as well. So just meeting with pretty much everyone. Really, really significant couple of days, politically speaking, for Zelensky. And of course, where's Putin? Nowhere to be seen. He's not in G7 anymore since 2014. So just sitting back in Moscow, just twiddling his thumbs, getting, I guess, angrier and angrier. With over 300 sanctions, the US targets Russia's circumvention and evasion, military industrial supply chains, and future energy revenues. This is from the US Department of Treasury. This is something that the EU is doing as well, is trying to close the loopholes to stop Russia from getting around the sanctions that have been placed on them. And here we have the US being tightening the screws on Russia. Um, EU leader promises to take on companies that help Russia violate sanctions. So, exactly what I was just saying, the EU's new package of sanctions against Russia will target more than 90 companies that help Moscow evade sanctions. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said yesterday in an interview with the German publication ZDF. Now, China, talking about Russia's political positioning and Putin's positioning particularly. This is pretty impressive ceremony that China organized for their Central Asian summit. So yeah, wonderful pageantry going on there, and incredible sort of scenes of cultural, I guess, well, just incredible scenes that China put on at probably quite some cost. But this was for the Central Asian summit. The important point here is that Russia weren't invited. Looks like China gets to be the regional hegemon over Central Asia. Now Russia loses again. I reported yesterday how Vladivostok has been given, um, well, Russia have allowed China to use the eastern port of Vladivostok, both from the land, so they can get in, access it through Russia, and then send their boats out from Vladivostok. You are starting to see China assert its regional superiority over Russia, and you're starting to see Russia become increasingly a vassal state of China. This is something that the Russians themselves, in the hierarchy in actually, if you look in strategic documents or in the Russian military and geopolitical sphere over the last sort of decade or so, they have worried about China doing exactly this. So they have been worried that China would treat Russia like a vassal state, and they were warning against this happening. But they've got no option. They have no other friends, and as the rest of the world sanctions China, okay, a large proportion of the world is kind of sitting in the middle, not really caring. But for the more developed nations and the richer nations and the Western nations, they are sanctioning Russia and pushing them out to the peripheries of the geopolitical landscape, and that has meant that Russia has had to rely increasingly on China to prop it up, which means that China is in that power position. Striking how Putin. So on the flip side, Putin and the Kremlin have been just willy nilly sanctioning individuals, saying that they can't, travel to Russia and so on and so forth. There've been loads of journalists and quite famous people here and there. But also, now this is fascinating. Striking how Putin is adopting Trump's perceived enemies as his own. So the new Russian sanctions list includes people Trump considers adversaries, and these are people that have nothing to do with Russia. So this is just them trying to be clever and divisive in terms of American politics. Just this is fascinating to me. The new Russian sanctions list includes people like Letitia James, who is one of the prominent lawyers involved in one of Trump's many court cases. Brad Raffensperger, who is was the involved in he's a Republican actually, involved in the Georgia um, electoral sort of claims. Trump phoned him to ask for more votes, or so on and so forth. So he's been sort of caught in the middle of this whole kind of Georgia electoral court case. But he has been sanctioned. So what's he got to do with Russian politics? And the officer who shot Ashley Babbitt. So in the 6th of January insurrection, where the loads of people stormed the Capitol, there was someone who was shot there by an officer within the building and died. She was called Ashley Babbitt, and the officer who shot them has now been sanctioned. Like, why? What are you doing? And of course, it's trying to get into the mind of the Kremlin, into the mind of Putin here, as to why they would do this, and it's all about dividing the US politically. So and trying to court the kind of MAGA Republicans, I think, in this case. Just yeah, really interesting. Russia is experiencing the worst labor shortage since 1996, with more than a third of Russian industrial enterprises unable to find workers, according to the results of a survey conducted monthly by the Yegor Gaidar Institute for Economic Policy. That is again going to be a result of A, sanctions, and B, huge amounts of people, mainly B, huge amounts of people being sent off to war. To the tune of hundreds of thousands, and C, huge amounts of people leaving the country so that they don't get mobilized. Upwards of 1 million people, arguably, having left Russia. So all of this comes together to provide a labor shortage. Um, and finally, Georgia, where the Georgian parliament, or the Georgian government, sorry, in their more pro-Russian stance against maybe the will of the Georgian people, have decided to allow planes to land and take off from Russia into Georgia, and that is something that hasn't taken place for 4 years. So there's been a 4-year ban on Russian flights. That has been changed, and the Georgian people are still protesting about this, which is great. This is several days after that decision was reversed, and we have that pro-Western, pro-EU sentiment in Georgia coming out onto the streets, and that is good news for pro-Ukrainian people who are pro-Ukrainian, because these are one and the same, sort of the pro-Western, pro-EU, pro-Ukraine. You can see Ukrainian flags there. You can see EU flags. This is really important for sowing discord in Georgia, or not so much for sowing discord, but for showing that not all Georgians are behind Russia, and in fact, there's a, a large amount of the population who are behind Georgia moving away from the Russian sphere of influence. Anyway, that is today's news. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really happy that you have chosen to spend your time with me rather than your family. Go and get back to your family. It's Sunday. But really appreciate you being here. Thanks. Take care and speak soon.